Hello and welcome to the Echo Chamber podcast. My name is Tony Groves, and today we are back talking to the Global Alliance for Tax Justice. And I've been waiting to have this conversation again because the last time I spoke to this individual, I left thinking, do you know what, change is possible. But then again, I have to deal with the other guy all the time, and I think change isn't possible. Martin, how are you?
Oh, sure, change is possible with me, Tony. I live for change. The day you start getting afraid of change is the time to hang up your spurs. It just is.
Yeah, no. Can I just give a quick shout out, Martin, we did a podcast yesterday on the fact that within the Irish state there are two committees currently fighting over who has you as their star witness, whether it's the Public Accounts Committee or the Department for Social Protection. It's good to see that we're making an impact within the state. It's really positive, to be honest with you. And
it's tax justice stuff as well, Tony, which is great.
It actually really is. It is majorly. Anyway, I'm delighted to be rejoined on the podcast by Caroline Otham, all the way from Nairobi in Kenya. And she is the Campaigns and Policy Coordinator for the Global Alliance for Tax Justice. She's also a phenomenal spokesperson on how tax abuse impacts the underserved already by our society, particularly women and single parents and children. Caroline, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us again.
Thank you, Tony, for having me today. It's a pleasure to always have these conversations with you.
Listen, I'm gonna go. The last time we spoke, it was me, you, and Rory, and we were chatting about tax avoidance, tax evasion, and tax abuse, as we call it, and how it impacts predominantly on women, which it does. We've seen the burden of, particularly around COVID, the burden has fallen on women across the globe. But since then, you've had a conference online. Would you like to just give us a bit of a flavour of those events and some of the things that came from that?
Definitely. That was a very momentous period because it's an annual campaign that we have on tax justice for women's rights. So looking at how we can advocate for multilateral organizations and national governments to be able to institute reforms within the tax architecture to make taxes work for women. So during that period in March, and amazingly enough, it coincided with the Commission on the Status of Women conference. And during that period that ran from the 15th of March to the 26th of March, there were quite a number of activities that took place across the world. So working closely with our regional networks in Africa, in Asia, Latin America, North America, as well as Europe, quite a number of activities took place that were coordinated to sort of push for similar messaging on making taxes work for women. For instance, we had a high-level event during the Commission on the Status of Women, as I said. And during this event, we had high-level speakers from the different regions, speaking from regional perspectives, sharing how tax injustice continue to really burden women from the different regions of the world. And the stories are quite similar, And so it's really something that came out quite strongly. And amazingly, from the audience, we had somebody from the Dutch government, and she made a comment that, that was quite an eye-opener. Some of the conversations that we were having were new to her. And so for her, she was really looking forward to integrating those into some of the policy work that she does within government. Beyond that, we also saw national level organizing. We had youth from Uganda and Burundi having policy dialogues on making taxes work for women. And you see, when the youth are also involved in this critical conversation, it means that we are building the next generation of champions to be able to advocate for this very critical issue on make tax for women. Beyond that, had very good organizing in Asia, particularly in the Philippines, in India. We had women coming together within the spaces that could allow, because of COVID restrictions, to be able to raise their voices, be it digitally or be it within physical spaces, of course, while observing COVID restriction measures, to really advocate and push for these issues.
Going to interrupt the podcast now because we have to, actually. That's why there's it's unbelievable amounts of people listening to these podcasts. There's an unbelievable amount of podcasts being produced. And we are, I think this week we're going to hit about 520 just on the echo chamber alone. We're seeing a third annual housing conference in Maynooth that we're going to be covering. Things that weren't possible a few years ago. However, you don't understand how tenuous it is. It's genuinely hand to mouth around here, and we need support. It's really that simple, Martin.
It is, Tony, and like we're doing a lot of work outside of podcasting as well, which it all feeds off the Tortoise Shack. I mean, I've done the podcast with Mick Clifford on bogus self-employment. These are all kind of civic stuff that we're doing outside of the Tortoise Shack, and I know you're doing it as well.
Yeah, but like I just what frustrates me is this trying to. I get this awful thing where we're understanding why we do what we do, why we want to continue to do what we do. But it's very hard to square the circle of making it viable. I mean, there's no way we can have ads or sponsors. Actually, we're very ad and sponsor unfriendly, to tell you the truth. And that's telling listeners that they just not. Who's interested in people who are pulling against the establishment as vociferously as we are? But the issue remains that if this doesn't start to actually
turn a book, Tony. Yeah,
it's not even turn a book. We have an opportunity here, I think, with people that we get to speak with and people to actually make impacts, and we've made impacts. You're in the PAC. We've seen there's things coming out of the last season of Police that the Garda Commissioner himself is involved in.
That's right.
There's actual fundamental changes happening in Irish society that we help to do, but it won't continue to go unless somebody puts their hands in their pocket and goes to patreon.com/Tortoise Shack and helps us do it.
And like the work we're doing, or like the work I'm doing with whistleblowers now, Tony, as well. Like we've had Noel on, we're going to have other whistleblowers on. These are people who have put themselves on the line to try and make things better in Ireland, and the only outlet they get is us. Yeah.
No. I mean, I don't know what more I can add to it other than I really do hope if you enjoy what you hear or if you get something out of it that you'll give something back, because realistically, there's a lot of competing aspects for people's money out there. I get that, but we're asking for the price of a coffee once a month. A fancy coffee would be nice. But we'll settle for a cheap coffee if that's what you want, and you get loads back in return. That's the truth as well.
That's the difference. There's an awful lot that comes back, a huge amount. I mean, as much as any radio station is turning out, Tony, on shows. And just to remind people where they have to go to become a patron of the Tortoise Shack, it's patreon.com/Tortoise Shack, and it's not expensive. It's really not. So if you want to see a difference, you're going to have to pay for it. It's that simple.
To really advocate and push for these issues. Now, beyond the CSW, remember, the campaign also overlapped with a very important policy-making space, that is the IMF World Bank annual spring meetings. So within that space, we also put in our voice and were able to keep on advocating for the same issue, particularly in the context of COVID response and recovery measures that we are seeing being dished out to different multinational companies. And what we are saying is that these recovery measures really should put people first over profit.
I think you've just summed it up there in terms of putting.
Hello.
Yeah, we got you there. Sorry, we lost you for a couple of seconds, but we have you there. No, you're making the point that the recovery fund should put people at the center and not multinational companies, and I think that's actually crucial because we have seen only in recent days, the Irish media have been, oh my God, we realize that the double Irish that you may be familiar with, whereby, you book profits in one jurisdiction and you produce something in one jurisdiction and you book the profits in another, i.e. Ireland. We closed that loophole several years ago, but we left it open because we said we'd close it, phase it out over time. And I saw one example recently where it was Google's profits that they put beyond the reach of sovereign states within Ireland actually was more than the entire Irish GDP for a full year in 1 year. So, when the last time we discussed this, you were able to sort of give us a context of what that actually means in terms of the damage to, say, medical spending in India or in Kenya or in the other places across the globe, because this is what happens when you put that money beyond the reach of sovereign states. Could I ask you, just on the back of that conference, are there a couple of demands that you guys are looking for now? Are there sort of key things, that changes that you're demanding or that you're asking for and think that people should be getting involved in?
Beyond the campaign itself, really, it's about the real and transformative change that we need to see happen, that we need to see the local citizen benefit from. This kind of tax reforms that we are talking about. So when we say that governments should be able to curb the taxes that they lose through some of these illicit and illegal tax practices, really is something that would go a long way to plug in any public budget deficit in order to be able to fund social protections, to fund education, to fund healthcare. And this goes a long way to really serve the poor and the marginalized, particularly women from across the world. Again, it's important for the reform of the international financial architecture, where all countries are sitting on the same table negotiating for these tax rules, so that it's not just a club of rich countries sitting and making these decisions for the rest of the world. So it's important for a United Nations intergovernmental tax body to be put in place to ensure that these negotiations happen within the auspices of the United Nations and not what we are currently seeing within the OECD framework. Really, this is a very important reform that needs to happen as soon as yesterday. And also, Tony, as you mentioned, tax havens are a real burden, particularly because they enable the outflow of capital from global South countries. And this is to the detrimental of service provision to citizens in these countries. So it is important that tax havens, secrecy jurisdictions really is something that governments need to tackle in a collective manner, because international cooperation is really something that should be key in tax reforms within the international space.
In Ireland, we've seen that in particular during the COVID crisis, that it is women on the front line that are mostly affected, work-wise, tax-wise, childminder-wise, that it is all of these issues that are affecting women most. That's a product of an unfair tax system, that pressure and that stress is placed generally on women first. Is there anything here in Ireland we should be doing about that?
Absolutely. And you have put it so well. We see women being negatively impacted by the crisis itself and also by its socioeconomic impacts. And you've mentioned so well, we are looking at increased childcare responsibilities. We are looking at increased cases of gender-based violence. We are looking at cases of governments putting companies over people and the planet. And really, not only within Ireland, across the world, governments should be able to ensure that any recovery measure that is put in place should be able to center a feminist analysis of the situation. Because the crisis itself, the recovery and the responses are all a feminist issue. So at the end of the day, government really should consider that it is a feminist issue. Number two, the centering of the care economy really needs to top the table. We see women taking on board an overwhelmingly increased share of care responsibilities within this period. And it tells you that the care economy is a very important aspect for economies to be able to function effectively. And therefore, the reorganization of social care is something that really needs to also top the charts. We also see these recovery measures, as I said, really need to center women at the center of it all. So those are some of the things that I can mention for now. And of course, and most importantly, look at the past, the resource envelope, and how to be able to plug those by not continuing to disenfranchise those who've been disenfranchised historically and over the years.
I think that's it's a point you've made before, and I think it's really, really, really well made. That Martin made the point that how during the COVID crisis, the pandemic, we've seen and I love your phrase around the care economy and how it's been devalued. But we saw in Ireland and across the globe during the global financial crisis that they were also left behind. You know, that our biggest increase in homelessness in Ireland was single parents, which are predominantly like 90% women with single mothers with children, or whatever phraseology you want to put on it. And they carried the burden of our homeless crisis. So if we don't center that, as you put it, and we don't learn from history, we're doomed to repeat it. But what I suppose, to bring it down again, I hate to do that, but bring it back to the economics of this. It's global solidarity that's the only way to change this, because we've said before that I think it's 8 countries account for over 85% of this tax avoidance. I don't know if you've seen some of the plans from the US in terms of the new president, President Biden, and his ideas on maybe trying to tempt some of this money home and do that. But he has done one thing which was interesting. He hasn't cut corporation taxes. If anything, he's planning on increasing them. What is your guys? Have you got any read on that yet, or what do you feel about those plans at this stage?
So the move by the Biden administration to really look at a minimum corporate tax is something that is welcomed. And it's also a conversation that has been ongoing because of the phenomenon that we refer to as the race to the bottom. So when countries keep on giving tax incentives to multinational companies to be able to invest in their countries, and this happens in such a way that they keep on reducing the corporate income tax. And so, for instance, you would have so many countries within the global south foregoing tax revenue in that regard. And that is tax revenue that would have gone to fund public services. So by the Biden administration coming out strongly and to speak on the issue of a minimum corporate tax really is something that is much welcome, and is something that really we have been advocating for within the tax justice movement. As the Global Alliance, we are continuing to work closely with our regional members, with our regional networks, to be able to see how this would impact on other countries across the world. So it's something that we are continuing to discuss and to be in discussion with different policymakers and different governments to be able to advance that particular element.
And we see that particularly in Ireland, where we have low corporation tax. that over the years, the burden of taxation has shifted to the individual, and within the individual, the burden of taxation is predominantly on women in difficult circumstances. They carry the heaviest load. And it's very hard to get people to understand that the less companies pay, the more the individual pays. It's very difficult to make that connection when it's really quite a plain connection. How do we get people to understand that this is the connection, that the less we tax multinationals, the more the individual has to be taxed, and within that, the more women will suffer?
It's a very important angle that you have raised, that governments really need to consider the tax system and how it affects the different demographics on one hand, and on the other hand, to look at ways that they can be able to generate enough revenue from multinational companies. Now, one of the ways that governments can be able to do this, and even citizens can be able to keep on pushing for reforms, is for citizens to be able to understand that for the pie that goes particularly, let's say, to the education sector, for it to increase, it would be important for the government to plug in the loopholes within the tax system. That is one. And by doing this, the government should be able to look critically at multinationals that avoid paying taxes or that evade paying taxes and be able to curb those. Number two is for organizations like the Global Alliance for Tax Justice to be able to provide this critical tax education so that citizens get to understand that on one hand, I have an obligation to pay taxes, but on the other hand, it is also a prerogative of the government to be able to provide quality public services on the other hand. And so when there is a clear understanding in relation to what you pay as a citizen in form of taxes and what you receive on the other hand as public service provision, really should be commensurate. The other element to this equation is on the fact that when you look at multinational companies and compare that to what citizens pay. For instance, there's a research that was done in Zambia. A local grocery trader and a huge mining company. Between the two, the research revealed that it's this local grocery trader who paid more taxes than the multinational company. And why was that? This is because the multinational company was able to use loopholes within the laws, within the tax system, to be able to shift profits to another jurisdiction and thereby avoid paying taxes within Zambia, because this was a study that was carried out in Zambia.
I put it to you, Caroline, sorry, that they're not loopholes, they're policy choices.
Yes. So by tax planning policy choices, as you put it, really enabled this multinational company to be able to shift their profits to a different jurisdiction. And this is something that really needs to be reined in and to be stopped, so that this local grocery trader and the multinational company, clearly you can see who needs to be paying more taxes, because the multinational company generates the economic activity within Zambia and therefore should be liable to pay taxes within Zambia.
I do want to touch on a couple of other things before we finish, but I just think it's important from an Irish perspective that so for example, we've seen when the IMF and the EU and the ECB all arrived and we had the Troika and we had the bailout, we were told, they're going to dictate what we have to do via austerity to get these loans that will help our country rebuild. One of the things that was sacrosanct that we wouldn't negotiate on was the corporation tax rate of 12.5%. We said that was our idea. Now we've seen effective tax rates. We have a thing called the knowledge box where you can You can say you're doing research and development and pay 2% on your profits. We used, obviously the double Irish is quite famous. Double Irish with a Dutch sandwich. We have examples where Monster Energy were able to put, I think it's 35 billion beyond use. Monster Energy drink, like a bloody sports drink, 35 billion through Ireland with no taxes, because we allowed them to use the shifting, not of profits, but of intellectual property that they were selling between themselves. So this network is quite complex and very difficult it sounds difficult to unpick, but it's not really. These are quite, like they disguise it in terms like intellectual property and all these accounts, sub accounts, sub funds, sub funds in other places, and all of these other things that are disguising what is in effect, just as you put it, tax abuse. Ireland has a big role to play. We need to put pressure on our government to acknowledge that this is our role in it, but we also need to understand that if this revenue, we have to break it to us. If our economy lost it, what do we replace it with? We have to have an honest conversation with that around the globe, where people are going to end up. Do you think people are ready to have those conversations about what it means, and and how we address this? As in, we are one world. Let's talk about it in one world capacity, or will the money just move on to the next tax haven?
Yeah, you mentioned quite some important points. One of the points you raise is on IMF, World Bank conditionalities.
Oh, yeah. And
definitely this is an area that we continue to push back on. Because when you look at some of the austerity measures that are proposed by the likes of the IMF or the World Bank, at the end of the day, who do they impact negatively the most? It's women and other marginalized groups. And it also goes a long way to really disenfranchise economies in the global south. And this did not start yesterday, Tony. When you look at the structural adjustment program of the 80s and 90s, really, this left a lot of global south countries' economy reeling, and most of these countries have not recovered. But we continually see the IMF and the World Bank continue to give conditionalities to these global south countries when they receive loans from these institutions. And also, when you look at the level of indebtedness by these countries to the IMF, to the World Bank, really the levels are becoming unsustainable. And this is something that really needs to be addressed as soon as yesterday. Public debt wage within global south countries is at a staggering point. And this has been exacerbated by the pandemic. We continually still see the IMF giving out loans. And within the context of these developing countries, it's important to also look at the socioeconomic structure, the accountability mechanisms in place. How are they? What are the levels of corruption per se, let's say so, in some of these countries, so that even as they receive loans and pay back the debts, then countries are in a position to do that comfortably. So what we are saying, and even with our partners within the debt coalition, is that debt to global south countries is something that should be repealed or should be cancelled. And debt moratorium is an important element for countries to be able to pull through the pandemic. And an important point that you also raised is around this complex nature of companies operating within the global finance system, and of course utilizing tax planning measures to be able to avoid or evade paying taxes. As I said at the beginning, a reform of the international finance and tax architecture is something that should be able to curb these practices and to allow governments to be able to generate enough resources to fund their public services.
I think you're right there. And I think that's something we see right across the globe. And debt forgiveness has to be part of that. But I'm going to move us on a little. Where you are at the moment, you're facing into a third wave, or you're in a third wave of COVID. Can you tell us a little bit what it's like there at the moment?
Yes. So right now, Kenya is in a very bad shape within the pandemic, let me say so. Experiencing a very terrible third wave with increased rates of infections and increased fatalities as well. And so we see the government introducing some strict measures to try and contain that. But we are also seeing the government providing vaccines, to one particular demographics. Let me say so. One is to the older, the elderly. Number two, to the healthcare professionals. And you see, when this happens, it means that just a small percentage of the population would be able to receive this vaccine. And we talk about vaccine apartheid currently because we see quite a small percentage of the vaccines coming down to global south countries. And what really does this mean? This is something that should not be happening. It's important to ensure that vaccines are accessed by everyone, no matter where they are within the globe. So be it in the global south, be it in the global north, vaccines should be accessible to all.
Yeah, I think that I know the EU was going through the TRIPS waiver and the things that have been happening, but the statistics are quite scary. It's less than 0.2 of 1% of vaccines have been administered in low income countries, particularly the global south, as you reference, and that goes back to what Mike Ryan of the WHO said: no one's safe until everyone's safe. And it must be, we have to be honest with ourselves that there's not been, you've referred to it as vaccine apartheid. And I think I don't think that's unfair. I think it's really, really true where you have, states, available, making, like the US are now making vaccines available to the cohorts of over 16s. Oh, so anybody over 16 years of age can opt into a vaccine, whereby a healthcare worker in the global south might not be able to avail of a vaccine for months yet. Some of them are planning for 2022 and into 2022. That is inequality baked into the system. And all of this is obviously, it comes back to, again, that idea that why can't we, for example, lift the intellectual property on these vaccines and allow countries like Kenya to produce them themselves and pay a licensing fee? I mean, it does, it's just bloody money. Let's save more lives and let's not do it that way. Surely that should be the most sensible step, Caroline, no?
Absolutely. So as I was saying, there's been a conversation that civil society organizations have started on the issue of vaccines, that vaccine inequality is something that should not be happening in this time and age, that it is important for intellectual property on vaccines to be lifted so that governments that are able to produce these vaccines are able to do so and to provide those to all people of all walks of life. We have seen so many people really miss out because they are not within the cohort that, government has determined to be the ones to receive the vaccines. And we are seeing people losing their lives. So at the end of the day, really, it should not be profit over people, but it should be people over profit.
Caroline, thank you very much for coming on, having this chat with us today. It's always great to talk to somebody as well informed as yourself. We learn as much from you, I'm sure, as other people do. And thank you so much for coming on, taking this time to have a chat with us.
Thank you. It was a pleasure speaking with the two of you. I hope to come back again.
Caroline, you despite the topic, you put a smile on my face every time we talk, and I think that's important. Just to let listeners know, we will be going back to vaccine inequality tomorrow with Hannah Salah in Gaza, talking about what's happening there in terms of what is also vaccine apartheid in terms of the state of Israel and what's happened in Palestine. So we will be going back to that issue as well. But I make sure you check out the Global Alliance for Tax Justice. Make sure you support the campaigns. Look at what we can do. Look at how we can tell our particularly within Ireland, we have to be honest about who we are and what our economy is built upon, and have a real conversation about how we unbundle that. And Caroline, thank you again. It was a pleasure to talk to you as always. Talk to you all soon, folks. Take care. Bye bye.
Tony and Martin, Martin and Tony, speaking to interesting people only. It's the Echo Chamber podcast. Subscribe now on Patreon.